Hello, I'm Kelly Colby, Communications Manager for the Department of Public Works. And today I have the pleasure of chatting with Assistant Director Rob Steen and Water Pollution Control Division Supervisor Andrew Belay. So recently I had some time with Andy at the Water Pollution Control facility, and we walked through the plant. We talked a bit about how technology is evolving and what the town is pursuing as we look towards the future. So today, I really want to touch on a lot of the questions I'm hearing from the public. So I hear a lot about cost. I hear a lot about timing, effluent, the use of innovative and alternative technologies. So before we jump into some of those hard-hitting questions, Andy, could you give us a brief overview of the wastewater treatment process?
Sure. So the wastewater treatment process starts at the Headworks building where all of our pipes in town lead. Here is where we screen out all of the trash and debris that may be washed into the sewers. There is a automated bar screen that rakes the bar racks every so often and removes physical rags, debris, and then it carries off into an aerated grit chamber where we remove grit, sand, and other fine particulate. We meter flow. We do odor control at the Headworks building before it carries over to the primary clarifier where scum floats to the top, sludge sinks to the bottom, and that gets removed from the process. And what you've got is a very nutrient-rich waste stream which carries on into our aeration basins, which is where we mix activated sludge, which is microorganisms and bacteria. They do the dirty work for us. They're the ones who convert that nitrogen into nitrogen gas and release it off into the atmosphere. So our job as wastewater treatment plant operators is to keep them happy. So that's what we do. After the aeration phase, the flow carries on to a secondary clarifier where that sludge will then settle out, and we will either remove it from the wastewater treatment process or send it back to aeration where it reseeds the aeration basins. At this point in time, the water then flows into a chlorine contact chamber where we add a little bit of chlorine before we discharge it back into the rapid infiltration sand basins out back behind our facility.
Yeah,
So the other thing, just to jump on that, so the other thing that aeration basin does besides removing nitrogen is it also removes organic carbon, which is when these plants were initially designed, they were designed to deal with carbon, frankly, because that's a food source, and if it gets into the environment, then the natural bacteria in the environment will consume that and will basically deplete oxygen in wherever they happen to be. So it's more within the past 20 years that we've been doing more nitrogen removal type things with it, and obviously the projects that we're about to talk about are nitrogen focused, but we can't lose sight of the fact that the plant still has to remove the organic carbon and things of that nature.
Right, and that really leads me to my next question, Rob. I was hoping you can give us an overview on is, so I understand that the nitrogen removal and new Headworks facility project that we are going to be talking about today is currently ranked #1 in the state's Clean Water Fund intended use plan for 2024. So obviously that speaks to the breadth of this project, the sophistication. Can you give us a little bit of an overview on really what that project entails and what technology we're pursuing?
Yeah, so Andy's current system, as he described it, does fine for the organic carbon piece that we talked about in TSS, which was the traditional things that plants did. It was retrofitted back, when did we put that anoxic zone in the front end?
Around the year 2000.
So about 2000, they retrofitted it back and put an anoxic zone in the front end so we could start dealing with nitrogen. So his permit limits him to 10 milligrams per liter of effluent of nitrogen. He traditionally gets about 6. As we started looking at the CWMP and thinking about how much nitrogen we could get out and how much we should get out comparative to how much sewering we need to do, we really set a goal of trying to get down to 3, which is pretty low for a modern day treatment plant. So this project is actually the combination of a couple different projects. One is the plant needs an upgrade just in general. So if we do nothing else with it, we now need to deal with the plant sort of writ large. 2, it's to deal with that nitrogen conversation that we're having. And by doing that, we're going to put a 4-stage Barnstable in where his aeration basins are now. Those are effectively aeration basins, but they have a sequencing of anoxic and aerobic zones versus just one. So they do a better job improving the wastewater. The nice thing about Barnstable as a technology, 4 stages means anoxic, oxygen, oxygen. If you want, you can put a 5th stage in with anaerobic, which will also deal with phosphorus. We don't have a phosphorus limit right now and are not driven to that, but at least gives the plant capability in the future to deal with phosphorus. After the 4-stage Barnstable, there was a decision that had to be made, and we looked at a number of different technologies that we could utilize. You could use sand filters, you could utilize the secondary clarifiers that he already has, or you could utilize something called membrane bioreactors, membrane technology. And if you look at those, they're like a big cassette of straws. I mean, lots and lots and lots of straws. And the wastewater sort of mills around the outside of that, and into the straws is pulled. The clean water and anything with any sort of solids in it drops out. MBRs were powerful for us for a couple of reasons. One, they were the technology that allow us to get the lowest limits on the plant and get us down to that 3 level. Two, they were actually not that expensive relative to the other technologies. In fact, they were the second least expensive technology.
Wow.
And part of that's because what it allows us to do is have less aeration tank volume, concrete. Because of the technology so efficient at removing solids, you can now have a bigger mixed liquor is what we call it, but a bigger bug population, to use my unofficial term. Your bacteria is more correct, but a bigger bug population in the aeration basins. So they can be doing more there, and then when they get to the MBR, we can separate them more efficiently. If we use a secondary clarifier as an example, which is what he currently has for technology,
Right.
you can't do as much there because it just burps out too much stuff. And we can't be doing that. So the project's going to be 4-stage Barnstable, followed by an MBR, deal with disinfection by chlorine contact again, like we're currently doing, and then some upgrades to the effluent pump station. Plus, as we've gotten into the design, we figured out there's some yard piping things we need to do. The initial flow splitter, which we thought was going to be adequate, turns out it's not going to be adequate. You know, things of that nature as we go to accommodate that technology. So am I getting at your question, or am I going around?
Yeah,
the edges of
no,
it?
definitely. And one of the things I'm hearing, and I know we talked about this when I visited the treatment facility recently, was so we're currently permitted at 10. We, on average, have been getting about 6. And you're talking about this technology eventually could potentially get us to 3. So give the average resident of Barnstable, give them an idea of what's the benefit there. Why are we pursuing that lower level of nitrogen?
Want me to take that?
Sure.
Yeah, so basically we have to nitrogen balance out the Lewis Bay watershed, which is what the plant resides in. It made sense as we looked at, well, backing up a little bit. So during the CWP process when we were working with the RAC, we looked at a number of different ways to deal with wastewater. If we put them into 2 very broad categories, one would be centralized, which is utilizing the existing plant. One is more decentralized, meaning you have multiple plants across the community. The second option, multiple plants across the community, proved out to be much more expensive, both in terms of capital and operating expenses, and frankly problematic because people usually don't want a wastewater plant sited near them. And there's not an existing one minus at the Marston's Mill School right now, and that's a very, very, very small plant out there to sort of stick footprint in. And then the third problem was particularly when you get out west, you get into the 3 Bays watershed. And should we define watershed, or do we assume everyone kind of knows what watersheds are?
Yeah, it's probably good to just give a quick overview of the watershed.
Throw a map up at some point, but what you'll see is that if you put a drop of water somewhere on the land, it flows to, frankly, the ocean in our area or a river. In all the drops that get put in any point of land that go to a certain point start to get collected and called a watershed. So what that means is if you're within the boundaries of that watershed, if I put a drop of water anywhere in there, it's going to get to this point, whatever that point happens to be in that circumstance. If I put it over here in this watershed, it'll go to whatever point that is. Does that make more sense?
Yep, absolutely.
So when you go to the 3 Bay watershed, and we have a number of watersheds in town, the southern ones are the ones that are dealing with nitrogen issues more than the northern watersheds. But if you go to 3 Bays, modeling has shown that you have to remove 100% of the nitrogen there in many cases, in many of the sub-watershed areas. That's problematic because there is no plant in the world that gets 100% of the nitrogen out.
Right.
So you really can't locate a plant there. You have to get it out of the watershed. All right, that brings us back to the main plant. So as we're looking now at a centralized collection system and leveraging Andy's existing technology, the plant's big enough to be able to deal with treatment. And it's actually even big enough, and I know we'll talk about effluent in a little bit, it's big enough to get the effluent into the ground. So that was to the plus side. The thing we had to balance out was the amount of sewering we need to do to compensate for the additional nitrogen we're putting in there. If it was at a 10, there's a lot more sewering, frankly more than we can actually do in Lewis Bay. Barnstable side would have to start to think about sewering in Yarmouth to try to deal with it. At 6, it's still problematic. At 3, we think we're starting to get into some balance point based on the modeling. That's still being worked on and still being looked at. but it's certainly better than 6 and 10. So the point of doing that higher level of treatment is that. Now, there's an ancillary benefit too. That's just the nitrogen conversation. One of the nice things about having an MBR at the backside of your plant is that your effluent quality it's a very high effluent quality. And what I mean by that is MBRs get down to the virus level. They're removing viruses from the water. What they don't remove is salts. PFOS is a salt, or the size of salts. So PFOS comes through MBRs. We're hearing rumor, and it's only rumor, that plants ultimately will have to do PFOS treatment. You have two real options technologically as of today. One of them is called GAC, granularly activated carbon. That's what we're using on our drinking water wells. The other one's called reverse osmosis, which is kind of like MBRs on drugs. It's kind of like a really beefed up version of an MBR, frankly. Membrane technology, but much smaller pore sizes, et cetera, and a higher pressurized. And in order to use either of those technologies, either GAC or RO for PFOS, you need to have an MBR in front of it.
Right.
If you have a secondary clarifier in front of it, you'll blind that GAC unit immediately and the RO unit won't work. So the benefits to the community are a number. One, you're getting better nitrogen removal, which we need to do to avoid more sewering, which is frankly more expensive than the nitrogen removal. Two, it sets the community up for additional treatment down the road. And then three, you're producing probably some of the best quality effluent that you can do, minus having an RO behind it. I know that's a long answer to your question, and I apologize for that, but hopefully getting to where you're at. Go ahead, bud.
No, I was just going to, back to the watershed and the nitrogen loading on the Lewis Bay watershed. I think kind of like the important thing there is that, okay, so currently we're treating to 6, and when we get to 3, I mean, what would you say, like the CWMP is essentially going to double the flows to the plant?
Yeah.
So double the flows to the plant, but we're discharging it at half the concentration that we currently do. There's really no change to the nitrogen loading on our watershed after sewering, you know, a significant portion of town and bringing it to the Barnstable Water Pollution Control Facility.
And there's economies of scale to doing that. You know, as we looked at it, that became obvious.
That does bring to light another question. So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of benefits here to this project, specifically utilizing the MBR. Sounds like obviously less sewering is a huge benefit, and then also just being able to proactively set the plant up for success for treating those contaminants of emerging concern down the road, having the technology in place now. So it kind of leads into my next question of, it sounds like it's easier to really upgrade and make the investment at the plant now, as opposed to looking at and focusing on a single centralized area of treatment, as opposed to sort of fragmented individual on-site systems. So how does that play into the role of these innovative and alternative technologies that we're hearing about?
So let me jump on that. So first off, the way you frame the question almost isn't right in some senses. And I don't mean that to be rude.
Yeah, no,
but,
correct. Please correct me.
I think both technologies are needed. You know, a lot of people will frame that question as an or question. It's IAs or the plant. I would argue it's an and conversation. There's aspects of the plan that cannot be accomplished with IA systems. They're never going to get 0. So there's portions of 3 bays that can't deal with it with an IA system. However, there's other places where we're either not going to get to for a very long time because it's a 3-phase, 10-year phase, and some value to that regarding IAs, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I guess. But there's phases that we're not going to get to for 20 and 30 years. Title V septic systems will be coming to the end of their natural lives, and homes will be being sold during that period of time. Rob Steen, not Department of Public Works, not town policy, would argue that once we have a generally approved IA system, and the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition is doing a great job working us to that point. They've been working with DEP on getting us there. Once we have a generally approved system that the Board of Health can start to implement and mandate, then at some point the community needs to have a conversation about, do we allow in these southern embayments Title V systems to be replaced with Title V systems? Or is it time to have the conversation, much like when I lived here in the 90s and I had a cesspool at my house in Centerville and it was dying and they said you can't put another cesspool in. You have to put in a Title V system. I think that natural transition is going to happen again with those. Now the other thing on the IA front is that right now when we first came up with the plan, we didn't know where the IA technology was going to go. Z had just started his work on those systems. We didn't have the data to understand it. what I'm hearing now, and again, I'm third party to it, I'm not directly involved, is that we're starting to get some pretty good results out of those things. If you look at our plan, it's 3 10-year phases, and there's a reason for that. Some of it was a workload thing, but part of it was the fact that it allows us to adjust as we go forward. So there's aspects, particularly of some of phase 2 and some of phase 3, which aren't going to happen for another decade to 2 decades from now, where the solution may end up being IAs. So then the question will come back, okay, well then why are we building a plant? You need to build this plant anyways. I mean, this plant, there's enough flow coming out of 3 bays that has to be done with us. You'll need this plant for that. Plus, you know, if this is just a cost conversation, and I don't know if it is, 2 things. Nothing gets cheaper with time. So if the plant's a $110 million plant this year, my guess is next year and the year after it will be more, because we're just chasing inflation and trying to get there. And then sort of the other aspect of that is that, as we talked about before, the existing plant is running to the end of its design life.
Right.
So if you look at that $110 million, and we can talk about the cost estimate more, and happy to do that, but if you look at that, roughly 40 to 50% of that are things that have to happen regardless. Period, the end has to happen just to keep the existing plant going as it currently is. So I think as you start looking about, is there value in pushing this off? I would argue no, because you're going to need to do a significant portion of it anyways now. I mean, you can't push all of it off. And additionally, you're going to very likely want to do, in fact, I know you're going to want to do the rest of it, and it's just going to get more expensive the longer you wait. Plus, as you mentioned, you're currently #1 on SRF.
Right.
If you go back to the state and say, hey guys, thanks, we really appreciate that, but we're not going to do it this time. Maybe we'll do it next time. And then at some point, they're like, okay, well, this is a big nut for us to try to figure out how to get through our systems. You may not get the same ranking next time. I don't know that for a fact. I don't work for the state, but.
Yeah, so that really does lead into my next question. Before that, I do want to sort of just put an end cap, unless you have something to add, Andy.
No, I just really like the way Rob phrased that as an and
Yes.
thing. I mean, they're both 2 technologies or 2 setups that achieve the same goal. So, you know, there's room for both, certainly in any solution.
I mean, at the end of the day, we want what both parties, the people that feel strongly about IAs, and I guess I would be labeled as the people that feel strongly about sewering, though I, again, would say both. Everybody wants the same thing. We all want clean water.
Clean water, right.
And I think both are needed in getting us there.
Yeah, and I guess the one real benefit of one centralized system, and Rob already kind of hit on this, but as needs change and as technology changes, you know, you can more readily upgrade one single treatment plant rather than going around town and upgrading every single IA system to include a carbon filter on the back of it,
Right.
you know, to address PFAS as an example. So it's a lot easier to manage in that
That's
regard.
an excellent point.
And we should actually pick up on that for a second, if you don't mind. Just sort of the history of wastewater on, well, not just here, but everywhere. I mean, it started as, let's try to separate our wastewater from humans, you know, running down gutters kind of thing. So then they went to, all right, let's get it underground cesspools. Then they went to, that's still not doing enough to get rid of BOD and TSS and prevent people from being exposed to viruses and things of that nature. And then with the Title V's. Now we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus is out there regarding the ponds. And most recently, we're starting to talk about PFAS, and that's just the beginning of a suite of contaminants of emerging concern. We were in a conversation, what was it, 2 days ago, 3 days ago with DEP about permitting the effluent side, and they alluded to, yet there's these other suite of issues that they're starting to think about. So it's not a static treatment train. It's not like, as long as we deal with nitrogen, we're done. We don't have to think about
Right.
this ever again. It's very likely, in fact, I'd almost guarantee it, that as we as humans learn more about what's in our waste, and as we are able to measure more things in our waste and understand the impact of those things, we will be needing to remove those things. And to Andy's point, to do that on individual lots all around town will be very difficult. We can put an RO on the backside of Andy's plant. It's not inexpensive, but we could put an RO on the backside of Andy's plant and deal with a whole lot of that. I mean, the effluent you get out of an RO is effectively distilled water. You can't drink it only because it lacks salts. You'd have to add some salt to it, then you can drink it.
Right. Yes, I mean, great points by both of you. I think we'll probably learn more during the 5-year adaptive management plan that the town is going to be responsible for putting out. So we'll learn a little bit more about how these alternative technologies are going to play into, the sort of longer phases of our comprehensive wastewater management plan. You touched a little bit on effluent already. Before we go there, just a brief breakdown on the cost for this project, because that's clearly a question we get asked about a lot. $110 million. Yep. Yes, number one ranked project on the SRF intended use plan, but why the cost, and maybe just a quick breakdown on that.
Sure. You want to do it or want me to do it?
Go for it.
Okay. So first thing you have to understand is cost estimating is an inexact science. I mean, that number is an estimate made by professionals trying to guess what the cost will be at this point next spring at this time. Mm-hmm. When they first made that, it was a year and a half later. And so what people will say is, look, you guys came through with 2 studies that looked at the headworks and the rest of the plant, and then worked at the nitrogen needs, and you thought it was going to be in the order of like 66, 67 million bucks to do those things. Now you're looking at 110. What happened? A couple things happened there. One, when those plans and studies came out, it was 3 or 4 years ago, and they were trying to predict what the market would be 4 years in the future. As anybody trying to predict any market 4 years from now, it is not easy to do. So there's an inexact science there. 2, I would tell you, having dug through that cost estimate with a fine-tooth comb, there's 30% of contingency on that plan. Mm-hmm. So really what they think the cost is going to be somewhere in the order of 95 million bucks, but because they can't predict the market and stuff, and they do not want to be underbid and don't want to underfund it, they've put a 30% contingency on top of it. So there's that there. And then 3, the other thing that happened is that once you start to get into design, you start to bump into the realities of an existing plant and start realizing, hey, we need an intermediate pump station because it's not going to flow the way we think it's going to flow from point A to point B. The influent flow splitter, as an example, works currently, but once we start bringing in more flow for the CWMP, it's not going to work the way we want it to work. We need to redo that. Things of that nature start coming up, and preparing the plant for the RO eventually, or GAC. So making sure the electrical's all in place, making sure all that stuff is ready to go, so that if the community does have to go to that, it has the ability to do that reasonably seamlessly. So all of that sort of broadly in that cost estimate increase that's there.
Yeah, so I mean, it would be fair to say that there are the costs for this project that also entail preparing us for the future too. Yeah, so okay, well, we talked a little bit about, you touched a little bit about on effluent. That's one of the number one questions I get asked in a lot of the public outreach meetings is, what are we going to do with the effluent? How are we going to treat it? Where is it going to go? So who can give me a high-level overview of that process and what we're looking at for the future?
I'll take
Rob?
that.
On a roll.
How come I get all the sticky ones? All right, so effluent. As we talked about before, the plant has the capability of treating all of the flow that we can send to it because it's got enough physical footprint to do the expansion we're talking about. The plant also has the capability to put the flow into the ground. It's currently the way Andy gets rid of effluent. He treats it, he puts it into beds next to his plant. If you saw a satellite image, you can see all these big square sand beds, like big square sandboxes.
Yep, we spent some time out there.
Yeah, exactly. So you saw them in your thing. He puts the flow into there and it settles down into the ground. That all works fine, and that will work for all of that. The question we're currently looking at is, does that cause downstream issues with mounding of groundwater? And as context to that, people need to understand that, for instance, this spring, we've had a wet spring. Groundwater moves by feet every year. In some cases, 8 feet, depending on seasonality and what's going on. We, on top of that, then add 6 inches or whatever it is of effluent that's well mixed in there. It's not really on top of it, but just adds to that total volume. And the concern is, okay, are we impacting homes downstream? We started looking at this through 2 studies ago, just a real back of the envelope look at it. We're concerned by what we saw, then did a deeper dive look at it, and then said, okay, how do we mitigate it? Here's where we stand with effluent. We looked at, do we take it to other places in the community and dispose of it other places in the community? What we're finding is wherever we would go, we're going to affect surface water bodies and groundwater bodies. Again, not from a nutrient perspective necessarily, but from just a volume of water issue. So that wasn't ideal. What we did find was that if we put 9 irrigation wells downstream of the plant on town-owned, currently town-owned property, in the areas that we're worried about mounding, we can control the mound. That can get managed. So then the real question comes, okay, what do you do with that water? It's been in the ground for 2 years, a year to 2 years at that point in time. It's well mixed with groundwater, frankly is groundwater. What are we doing? Those are the conversations we're having at DEP right now. To say, okay, we could throw it away, literally, which is you take it to the Nipty's outfall that's in Hyannis Harbor right now for stormwater, you put it in that, it goes out in the harbor, but it's a resource at this point.
Right.
It's groundwater we're throwing away. You've got a water system that at the same point in time is looking for sources of water. You know, is there some combination there that we should be talking about? And those conversations are going on. So I'm very comfortable that we can manage them out. The question that we're now working on is what do we do with the effluent? And I'm reasonably comfortable that if worse comes to worse, we'll just throw it away, but that seems silly. Pause, new paragraph. All of that potentially changes if a PFAS requirement comes through. Because if a PFAS requirement comes through, now we have to have a serious conversation about that RO system we talked about earlier. It's arguable now with this new plant that after it goes through the 4-stage Barnstable and the MBR, that what you're putting in the ground is actually cleaner than groundwater, and you're going to pollute the effluent. It is absolutely the case once you put an RO on the backside, that's there. And then the question comes, does it make sense putting it in the ground, or do we reuse it? California right now is probably the leading edge of water reuse and direct potable reuse. If you look at their plants, they've got a large traditional wastewater system, our Barnstable. They have an MBR, they have an RO, and then they go UV enhanced oxidation. That second project you see on the CIPs, if you look at the CIPs, there's another project hanging out there 2 years because we're not sure where it would go if it happened. That accounts for the RO and advanced oxidation piece. At this point in time, you've got a treatment train that would comply with California's treatment train requirements.
Wow.
We're working with consultants from literally across the nation. I think Greta's out in Colorado or California, and Jill's somewhere out there too, that are working these issues with those western states. Because the western states right now are dealing with this because they just don't have enough water.
Right.
We got the opposite problem. We got too much. And the conversation we're having is, do we reuse that, and how do we reuse that, and what does that look like in the state of Massachusetts, which currently doesn't even think about that. So those are the conversations we're having at DEP to try to get to position us regulatorily so that we can then have a conversation with the community to say, look, you've got some options. And which of these options do you want to do? Just for note, the water system is looking for about 2 million gallons of water a day as a redundancy, not because they're short any given day, but because of the way the regulations are, they need to have that available to them. That's probably going to cost north of $100 million to do, based on where we're thinking we're going to have to go to get that and pipe it back to here. We'll have, according to modeling, about 2 million gallons a day of excess groundwater that we're going to be pulling out of the ground or at the back end of the plant, depending on what treatment trains are there. Is there symbiosis there? So that's the conversation. I know there's a lot in that, and I'm happy to pick through all that with you. But that's where F1 is now. It's actively being worked. We are actively meeting with DEP on it. In fact, we have 2 meetings a month with DEP, 2 different groups in DEP on it. We have people from across the country that are actively working this issue with other states involved in those meetings, in addition to our modelers and things of that nature. I'm feeling very comfortable that we can manage the mound. Now we're just working on, okay, what do we do with that water when we pull it out?
Right.
What's next?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that conversation is going to continue to evolve. So I'm looking forward to digging into that, as we move towards the future. Before we sort of wrap up, is there anything either one of you want to add about the project or anything we didn't touch upon that you think is important for the community to understand?
Oh, at this point, I think everybody's got a pretty good understanding of the water quality issues that the Cape's faced with, so no need to get into that again. But, I just feel very fortunate, working in the industry. I get to clean up 1.5 million gallons of water a day. That's almost 500 million gallons of water per year. So, I think that when the opportunity's out there to do a better job doing that, it's worth taking. So, it's something I'm very excited about.
One way to look at this, and when we're out in the community talking, and I'm sure you've said the same thing, is that, you're dealing with a problem right now that took multiple generations.
Yes.
This problem didn't just happen yesterday. This became when Cape started. Look, my great uncle came down here in the 1930s and was a plumber and started installing toilets. So it kind of started with him, I guess. You've got multiple generations of impact that we're trying to solve in one generation. And what I'd say to that, I mean, there's lots of logical reasons to do all of this stuff. And I'm an engineer by trade. I tend to be a generally logical guy. But just to sort of think about it from a different perspective, you know, this is something our generation can do. You know, and it sounds corny to say the challenge of our generation locally, but it kind of is.
Right.
You know, we're faced with estuaries that have too much nutrients that we're producing in them. We now have the technological capability. We have the institutional understanding. We have everything we need to fix this problem, other than just, well, and I wouldn't even say that. To date, the town has showed an tremendous amount of will to fix the problem. I would encourage it to keep doing that. There's been a lot of time in the past where things come up and things get pushed off and people don't do things because, well, what about this or what about that? And inevitably what that goes through a cycle. You know, hey, there's 90% grants, you should put in sewers. No, that will cause development, don't do that. Well, development came anyways. Right. Or, hey, you're thinking about doing sewering, but there's this thing called a PRB. You should stop and think about PRBs. Well, and then a decade later, everyone figures out they're useful, but they're not panacea. You kind of need to go back to sewering, and we start again. You know, and so there's always this thing that will come up to try to slow things down and stop it. And I would just argue, folks, we're there. Let's just do this thing, because that way, now I've got 4 kids. I want my kids to be thinking about whatever the next problem is when they're adults, not this problem. Let's us fix this problem. They can then fix the next problem and move on with their lives. Because it's, you know, we've talked about it a number of times. The Cape is a water-based economy. We're based on the fact that we have clean beaches, clean water, clean shores. We can ensure that. So why don't we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. I guess really to wrap up, and you both kind of wrapped up very nicely there, what I'm hearing, sort of the key messages here are this project really does provide us with a wealth of opportunity, not just to protect our water resources now, but also to proactively be able to sort of shuck and jive and adapt to changing regulations in the future. So if you could leave a resident with sort of one final piece of why this project is needed, why this investment is really needed now, you know, what would that be?
Well, I think we kind of hit on it earlier, and it's really just kind of setting the stage for the next level of treatment. Even though you know, we're not talking about putting an RO system in right now, we are setting ourselves up to be ready to do that in the future, and I think that that's really important. So I guess I'll leave it with that.
That's great.
I'll go back to what we talked about earlier, in that, you know, if you know, all the mushy stuff that we just talked about aside, and all the stuff, if, you know, going back to the logic of it, if you don't do this, it is very likely the alternative that we're going to have to go to is going to be more expensive. Mm-hmm. It will be probably at least 40 or 50% of this cost anyways to just get Andy's plant where it needs to be going forward into the future. And on top of that, we're going to have to sewer a whole lot more area, possibly some of it not in our community, because it's a joint watershed shared by 2 communities. Right. So the fundamental logic of it is there. And then if you start looking at, you know, well, why this year versus next year, it's not going to get any less expensive. We know what we need to do. We know we need to get pivoted. We should start to address this problem. We can start to address this problem. Waiting is not going to make it go away. It's only going to make it worse.
Yeah, I think we've learned that.
Decades now on this stuff. Let's start getting, and I'm really proud of the community because they've done a lot in terms of sewering. They've done a lot in terms of starting reaching out. This is just the next big step of that. And I know it's a big bite. You know, you've got this plant coming through here, but fortunately you're only doing the plant to this level once. Maybe you do RO in the future, but it's not like every single year you're going to be dealing with a $110 million plant project. Yeah,
I mean, and one thing you said to me, Andy, when we visited the treatment facility was that the town really has always been at the forefront of wastewater treatment and ultimately protecting our water resources. So it seems like this is really the next logical step for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been almost like every 20 years there's a big project that comes on that kind of builds upon the last one, and this one is a solid building block. So
that's excellent. Well, I appreciate it. Both of you, thank you so much for taking the time. I think you certainly touched on a lot of the topics I get asked about frequently, so I look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.